We are moving into chapter 2 for the book, Live Not by Lies. And this chapter's entitled Our Pre-Totalitarian Culture. And you can take from that the author believes that we're moving into a phase of totalitarianism in our country. And he spends the rest of the book trying to help us understand how that is happening and what we can do about it. So in chapter 2, the author really tackles two main components. And the first is the conditions in Russia prior to the 1917 revolution. And he seeks to draw correlations between Russian culture and our culture today. And then in the second part, he looks at Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, and he tries to pull out some of her principles for identifying the signs of approaching totalitarianism. And she has 6 of those. We'll cover one in this particular session, but all 6 are fascinating. So I think you'll get a lot out of that. So to begin with the cultural context in Russia prior to the revolution. So I was not a Russian history scholar, so I've learned a whole lot preparing for this class. And most people assume that Russia was like Western countries in 1917, that the Industrial Revolution had taken hold, that they were beginning to modernize, but nothing could be further from the truth. Russia was an autocratic regime. It was ruled by a czar, and that's the Russian transliteration of the word Caesar. The czar owned the entire realm and everything within it. He owned his subjects. He owned all the mechanisms that caused the empire to function. And he had a corrupted aristocracy that helped him rule, and the bureaucracy, which really could have cared less about the people. They're mostly interested in lining their pockets. The population itself in 1900 was 80% peasants. So these people were living almost medieval lives, and they had no sense of the modern whatsoever. It was an agrarian economy. There was a rural overpopulation. There were so few large cities in Russia, but the population was spread out. But even yet, it was huge in the rural areas. Almost all the peasant households were part of a local commune, and each commune had a village assembly that managed all of their affairs. So they were disconnected from any form of national government. They had no individual rights. They had no property rights for the most part, and no sense of national loyalty. So it only takes a small spark to set off a large flame. And in 1917, there was quite a series of sparks in Russia. The first one was Tsar Nicholas, who was young, inexperienced, and not able to manage the empire. He could have cared less about his subjects or what they thought. And the Russian people were tired of the abuse and neglect they'd received from the czars over the last few years. There were widespread food shortages. There was massive poverty. There were 2 socialist groups that believed the way to resolve all these problems was to assassinate leaders. And they did that to the tune of several hundred. And of course, the Tsar responded with a security police that then used extreme measures to crack down, not just on the terrorists, but also on the people. There were issues with treatment of minorities, and Russia's 1.4 million man army was deployed in World War I. So they were unable to suppress any revolts that might arise. And then last, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, the Russian church had become completely corrupt. So they were providing no benefit for the people and staying away from many societal issues. At this point, the conditions were right for an empire-wide revolution. So I found a short video from National Geographic. It's only 4 minutes long, but it helps us understand the context of that year and all the things that happened in Russia. was quite the chaotic year in Russia, but most revolutions don't come out of a vacuum. So for many years leading up to 1917, we see young intellectuals in Russia that are radically opposed to the Tsarist regime. They were disenchanted with the church. We also saw in academia people who were advocating the principles of Marxism. They were enamored with Enlightenment philosophers like Rousseau, who advocated radical egalitarianism and no property ownership. Marxism was seen as a secular religion, and the priests and prophets of that religion were the intellectual class. These were all well-to-do intellectuals. And then conversion to socialism was seen as a conversion to the intelligentsia. Factory workers were guaranteed fair pay and benefits and privileges that the Tsar had never given them by the Marxists. And then people were promised that the new Marxist government would redistribute all wealth and then wither away. Those were Marx's words right out of the Communist Manifesto. Of course, none of those things really happened. But the key in correlating this era to our era are in the highlighted words. So we also have young intellectuals within our culture. We also have an academia or academic body that's advocating principles of Marxism. We also have a form of secular religion, like we talked about last time. We have folks that are extremely concerned about fairness and equity and benefits and privileges. And we have folks that are really interested in redistributing wealth. So these are all very common to both eras. They're not exactly the same as Russia, but they are disturbingly close. And there on the right, you'll see a couple quotes from Lenin. I thought those were very, very interesting, very prescient quotes. And they are the one thing about Marxists is they are honest about how they feel and what they plan on doing. So Lenin's perspective was, we use language that creates hate, that helps divide. And then we take hold of the youth. And he thought with one generation of youth, he could actually transform Russia. And he got what he wanted. He had one generation of youth that were radicalized. Of course, every revolution expands beyond the borders of the country where it starts. And as soon as the Soviet Union began to expand into Eastern Europe, we begin to see young intellectuals doing the same thing there that they did in Russia, advocating communist ideas, canceling anyone who didn't support those ideas. Many Czechs actually joined the Communist Party because they thought it was the opposite of the Nazi Party. And the Nazi Party had brutalized Czechoslovakia. Many were living on the verge of poverty. And any promise of wealth, any promise of more than what they had was acceptable to them. Unfortunately, once they allowed communist officials in their governments in Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, they began to expand that communist influence, that Marxist influence, and every sphere of life was politicized. Speaking correctly was enforced by the secret police, labor camps, of course, and dissidents paid a horrible price. So in this part of chapter 2, the author then transitions to Hannah Arendt. And Hannah was a fascinating person. She was a political theorist. She was a researcher living in Nazi Germany. She had to leave, go to Czechoslovakia after being arrested by the Gestapo and warned for researching anti-Semitism. That was a topic that the SS did not want researched, obviously. So after a few close calls in Europe, she eventually settled in the US, in New York, and became a writer and a professor. Hannah's a fascinating person in more than one way, and she originated the phrase, the banality of evil, in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. So she studied Adolf Eichmann, the SS officer really responsible for planning the Holocaust. And in her mind and in her book, she makes the case that true evil is so common. It's so banal. It exists everywhere. You can be a doting father or grandfather and a murderer in the same breath. And that's really the secular version of total depravity. In her mind, every single person in the world was capable of this kind of evil because they could segregate in their mind normal from evil. And then, of course, she wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism, which we'll be looking at in depth. We'll only be able to get to her first condition on this list, but she did write 6 different conditions that she felt could be seen in societies that were approaching totalitarianism. And in her mind, each one of these could be evaluated, and people could take action prior to these things maturing and resulting in a fully totalitarian society. And the first one is loneliness and social atomization. And so in pre-revolution Russia, loneliness was a common experience. So as the Industrial Revolution was beginning to take off, the peasants left their homes, they left their communes, they moved into bigger cities, they became factory workers, and they felt disconnected from their entire life, from their faith, from their family, from everything. So in our current culture, we also see the pervasiveness of loneliness. Social media gives the illusion of having friends, but it's just an illusion. And the pandemic isolation has made things much worse. So millennials and Gen Zers identify as lonelier than any other generation has identified. Back under pre-revolution Russia, the breakdown of social cohesion was huge. As I said, the Industrial Revolution was breaking apart all the structures that held the peasants' lives together. And there was no civic trust. And of course, they didn't trust the Tsarist government to begin with, but the Soviet authorities made that worse by creating artificial divisions between groups of people and then attempting to make them turn on each other. And it makes sense that the Soviet authorities did not want anyone unified because of the size of the population. Any large groups of unified people would be a threat. So in our culture today, we have seen this continual decline in respect for our country, loyalty to our country. We've seen a decline in connections to friends, neighbors, and communities. And we've also seen cancel culture turning people against each other and reporting each other and causing irreparable harm to others as a result of that division. And then last, exposure to ideologies purporting to resolve all social issues. So in pre-revolution Russia, that was Marxism. But in our current culture, that's cultural Marxism, that's critical race theory, that's a number of other theories that purport to be able to solve everything. And the desire to create a society that they never experienced, to have the connections that they never really had, is huge. Well, the problem is loneliness and social atomization really creates alienated individuals. And those individuals who have no sense of community or connection are a prime target for totalitarianism. So we're bringing it back around, as we said we would do in every session, to the Christian perspective. The author does a great job talking about history, talking about anthropology and sociology. But I believe we need to view the events in pre-revolution Russia and in our country today through the lens of God's word. And so I thought we would focus today on the church. We talked about Marxism several sessions ago, and in that discussion, we talked about the German church and how the German church was ill-prepared to deal with Marxism when it arose in Germany. They were involved in their own culture wars, and they were just unable to or unwilling to help stop the spread of that ideology. Well, it moved from Germany into Russia through academia. And academics espoused Marxism, but the church was unwilling and unable to help stop the spread in Russia as well. So the Russian Orthodox Church had actually become part of the Tsarist bureaucracy. So there were government panels that controlled what the church taught and what it did within its services. The clergy were unprepared to address Marxism. Their leadership even told them, we're going to stay out of social issues, we're going to stay out of political issues. And that's exactly what they did. The Russian Orthodox seminaries were hotbeds of socialism. So radical concepts, radical egalitarianism, those things were all allowed in the seminaries and taught. So even if the clergy were inclined to say something about what was happening, they wouldn't have. And the church focused exclusively on piety. So in their mind, the church only dealt with spiritual issues. And as the revolutionaries began to gain control of secular affairs and gain control of governmental agencies, the church simply said nothing. The peasants themselves, they had minimal education. Many couldn't read or write. And so the church provided by way of spiritual nourishment was almost nothing. Many times they couldn't understand the services they were participating in. So there was no exegesis, there was no discipling. The church was basically malnourishing the people. And then some Christians actually supported Bolshevism. So they saw what possibly could be the fix for social conditions, and they got on board. Unfortunately, when they began to see the means being used by the Marxists and the ends that they would arrive at, it was too late. So thousands of clergy of the Russian Orthodox Church were arrested, and lay people, and imprisoned, and many were killed. Tens of thousands were killed. So the church was brutally suppressed. And so my question, two questions actually, as we talk about the church and the role of the church in these kinds of environments, could the Russian church have impacted the culture sufficiently to avoid the revolution of 1917? Is it possible that they could have had such an impact in their society that they could have been salt and light, that they could have prevented these events, these horrible events? And then the second question is, how should the modern church respond in light of our own spiritual and cultural decline? What's our actual responsibility to help prevent where we may be headed? And I included scripture here, 2 Corinthians 10, 4 through 5. And this is not the entire mission of the church, obviously, but it is one mission of the church. It says, the weapons that we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. We take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. So did the Russian church demolish strongholds? Did they demolish satanic strongholds? Did they demolish strongholds of ideologies that were godless and atheistic? Did they even address those ideologies? And I think the answer is no. And I think that's something we need to seriously consider as a charter for the church today. And that's very much part of the reason that we're doing these classes, is so that we can address that before it's too late. So this is our standard resources list. I have added 2 new books. The first is A Concise History of the Russian Revolution. And I'm reading through this now. This is a great book, very concise, as the title indicates. And it gives you a great chronology of all the events that happened in the revolution, if you want to dig a little bit deeper. And I think we've seen that there are a lot of parallels between that time and ours. And the more we understand about history, I believe, the better we can avoid repeating the same mistakes. Then the second book is called Caught in the Revolution. And I ran across this accidentally at Books A Million, of all places, in the bargain bin. And it was written by Helen Rappaport. And the book is about the revolution, 1917. And it is firsthand accounts of Westerners who were caught in Petrograd. They could not get out of the city as the revolution is erupting all around them. They were doctors and lawyers and regular family, visiting friends in Russia, or, there were a few newspaper folks there as well. But it's firsthand accounts that relate to exactly what happened on the ground. And I've just looked through it briefly. Some fascinating information there. So just like reading in your newspaper, eyewitness accounts. So that's very interesting. So next time we'll wrap up chapter 2. We're going to look a lot deeper into Hannah Arendt's principles, or 6 principles for helping identify pre-totalitarian conditions. We covered loneliness and social atomization today, but there are some others in there that are very, very enlightening. And I think that we're actually going to be able to tease out some things, some actions we can take to help head some of them off, hopefully. We're going to talk about the role of intellectuals in revolutionary activities. So you're noticing by now a common theme of intelligentsia, the common theme of academia as being sources for these ideologies and mechanisms for them to be persisted and advanced. And that's something we really need to dig into, because I think we have the exact same conditions here. And then lastly, we'll talk about the impact of fatalism on our culture.